This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omaha Dro Institute, and this episode is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 168 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. When we study the history of colonial America, we tend to focus on various European colonists, and the rivalries they had with each other, and the rivalries they had with Native Americans. But humans weren't the only living beings living in North America. Rivalries existed between humans and animals too, and these human-animal rivalries impacted and shaped how European colonists used and settled North American lands. Andrea Smalley, an associate professor of history at Northern Illinois University, and author of the book Wild by Nature, North American Animals Confront Colonization, joins us to explore the many ways wild animals shaped colonists' ideas and behavior as they settled and interacted with North American lands. Now, during our investigation, Andrea reveals the different kinds of wild animals colonists encountered in North America and what they thought about those animals. How specific animals like the beaver, wolf, and fish impacted and shaped early English colonists' ideas about what it meant to tame and possess land in North America. And how North American animals served as tools Native Americans used to stymie English and later Anglo-American colonization. But first, are you on the Ben Franklin's World email list? If not, you should be. As a member of the email list, you'll receive details about each week's new episode, as well as occasional emails about upcoming meetups and events. Plus, as a member of the email list, you'll also have the option to join our exclusive listener community on Facebook. To sign up, text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, are you ready to explore the wild side of early America? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an associate professor of history at Northern Illinois University. Her research specialty is United States environmental history, and she's the author of 3 articles and a book, with the book being titled Wild by Nature, North American Animals Confront Colonization. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrea Smalley.
Thanks for having me.
Andrea, we're really excited you could join us because you study a field of history, environmental history, and this is just a field we haven't really discussed much before. So I wonder if we could start with you telling us about this subfield. What exactly is environmental history, and what do environmental historians study?
Well, I'd say that the obvious answer, of course, is environmental historians study the environment. And I think for most people, if they're not familiar with environmental history, they might think that it's simply the study of the ways in which people have affected the environment in the past. And that's certainly part of what environmental historians examine. But environmental historians go beyond that to explore and explain the interactions between the human and non-human worlds. And what's interesting about environmental historians is they start from the premise that the environment is not just a stage on which human history takes place, but that it's itself a historical actor, that the environment is a participant in history. And that's the real difference in environmental history as opposed to other types of historical studies that might engage some parts or talk about some parts of the environment. The environment really creates possibilities and imposes constraints on what humans have been able to do in the past. And so environmental historians study a really very wide range of things, from physical changes in the environment to how human societies have interacted with the environment economically, politically, legally, and culturally. So there's a really wide range of things that environmental historians can study.
And we're going to talk about some of the interactions early Americans had with their environment today as we discuss details from Andrea's book, Wild by Nature, which explores how animals played a leading role in the colonial American story and actually altered its outcome in unanticipated ways. Andrea, why don't you set the scene for us? What kinds of animals did early colonists find as they moved into the region that you study in your book, which is the Chesapeake and southeastern region of North America?
Colonists encountered many of the same creatures that we still find today in that region. White-tailed deer, porcupines, muskrats, skunks, rabbits, foxes, opossum, waterfowl, fish of all sorts. But they also encountered some animals that we might not usually associate with that region, such as bison, wolves, and cougars. Colonists also ran into some species that are now extinct, like passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet. For some European observers, though, they even went beyond what they observed and wrote about animals that they didn't actually encounter, but they'd heard about, that they'd heard rumors about. So some writers wrote about unicorns that might live in the interior, or John Jocelyn, for example, wrote about a tree buck that was an imaginary creature that was shaped like a deer with horns of a gummy substance and didn't have any eyes or mouth. Or he also wrote about seeing a merman in a river that grabbed hold of an Englishman's canoe. So they wrote about a whole host of different kinds of animals, both that they had seen and those that they hadn't seen. But for the most part, the interesting, the kind of important thing about the animals that European colonists encountered in the Chesapeake and the Southeast is that they were mostly benign creatures. There weren't very many harmful creatures, and most were useful in some way.
Unicorns and mer people, huh? Are these rumors why you chose to study animals and how they impacted colonial settlement in the Southeast and Chesapeake? Or did you choose this geographic area for some other reason?
The book is primarily a legal history, and I was looking at English colonizing and really the laws of possession that revolve around English colonizing. So I started in the Chesapeake because it's the site of the earliest permanent English settlement, and I wanted to kind of stay in the heart of English colonizing and the legal context of English colonizing. And so starting in the Chesapeake and moving across the South, through the Southeast, through Virginia, across the Appalachians into Kentucky, and then ending in the Southern Plains in the 19th century, it allowed me to kind of stay in the heart of that Anglo-American legal context.
Now, when the English colonists started to arrive in the Chesapeake and in the Southeast, what did they think of all the animals that surrounded their new homes?
The first thing that colonizers remarked on in relation to animals was their abundance. They were amazed by how many animals were there, the varieties of animals. Early explorers and travelers' accounts can almost become tedious in their long listing of different varieties of animals, the different kinds that they saw. Many English writers worried that their audiences would think they were exaggerating the great numbers of wild creatures they encountered. And this isn't really surprising when you compare the American animal environment to the English one, which had been, even by the 17th century, had been kind of largely tamed. In the English context, in the English environment, by the early 16th century, wolves, Eurasian beaver, brown bears, wild boars, and lynx had all been more or less eliminated from the English countryside. And animals like deer and rabbits had already been legally classified as game and were protected by restricted game laws or enclosed and privately owned deer parks and rabbit warrens that only the elite had access to. So what was really remarkable to English colonists was the fact that American animals were free. And they were free in two senses. They were both unrestrained, they roamed everywhere, and that they were unowned. Nobody possessed them. So that was really the thing that seemed particularly remarkable to colonizers.
Was it just the English colonists who seem fixated on the abundance of wildlife and the different types of wildlife they saw in North America? I mean, how did the French, Spanish, and Dutch colonists react to the North American wildlife that they encountered?
There are some similarities, and obviously the abundance theme runs through all of the different colonial accounts. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch, all the Europeans who come to the New World write about and remark upon the kind of almost fabulous abundance of North American animals. But for the French and the Spanish in particular, their interactions with the New World wildlife, the New World animal environment, were somewhat different. And they're different because of the different types of colonizing, the different forms of colonizing that the Spanish and the French pursue in the New World. For the Spanish, they're focusing, and a lot of their texts tend to emphasize much more the strangeness of American animals. So some of the earliest natural histories of America come from Spanish writers who depicted New Spain's most unusual animal inhabitants. So they wrote about manatees or armadillos, and especially bison. French depictions of American animals tended to highlight the interactions of Native Americans and wild creatures. So how Indians used and thought about wild animals. And I think that those differences, and these are broad generalizations, obviously, but I think those differences are related to the different ways in which the Spanish and the French colonized. For the Spanish colonizers were really sort of bent on acquiring riches in silver and gold. And so exotic animals were interesting as curiosities, but that's it. They didn't see them as being particularly profitable as silver and gold. And the Spanish version of colonizing was obsessed with subjugating indigenous peoples rather than occupying their lands. So it was conquest that they were concerned with, not settlement, because that's what legitimized the Crown's authority over American territories. So for the Spanish, the American animals were useful only if they could, be made subservient as well. So in a wild state, they were not very valuable. For the French, that's a very different situation where American animals were very valuable to them, particularly fish and furs quickly kind of replaced their initial dreams of finding silver and gold. So for the French, their first encounter narratives reflected the central roles that indigenous animals and indigenous people would play in shaping what would become a commercial empire in the New World. The Native Americans who trapped furs for the French to trade, they were really central in French depictions of the American animal environment. So they really highlighted the interactions between Native Americans and wild creatures. They wrote about Indians' special skills in capturing wild animals and wrote about how Native Americans, their various hunting methods, what they thought about animals. So English colonizing was different from the French and the Spanish in that it was really focused on settlement. And so those first encounter narratives tended to repeat some of the same themes about abundance that were in other European accounts. But English writers told a different kind of colonial story that predicted a wider range of roles for animals. And that wider range of roles were all things that would help colonists settle in North America.
It sounds like animals really played a central role in the different imperial visions that Europeans had for their colonies in North America. And I wonder, because, this actually sounds really different from the other histories we've considered, how you were able to research and find the different roles that animals played for different European colonists in the historical record.
Mostly looking at various accounts, colonial promotional accounts, descriptive accounts of North America. Some of those early first encounter narratives, these reports back to investors or supporters of colonization, natural histories that people write describing the New World, would write about do these kind of laundry lists of animals that they found and what kinds of uses that they could be put to. And again, looking at those English accounts, you can see that the English writers tended to imagine way more possibilities for animals. They saw more so than Spanish and French accounts. Yes, animals could be trade goods, turned into trade goods. Animals could be food, but they also wrote about animals as being possibly good for medicinal purposes. and perfumes. They also saw animals as kind of clues to what the land might be used for. So if there were lots of animals grazing in a field, that might be a clue that this land could support English livestock. So they imagined all these different ways that animals could be used to support settlement.
Now, to what degree did animals actually impact and shape the way that English colonists settled in the Chesapeake and in the Southeast?
The animals affect settlement in a variety of ways, and that's really why I study and organize the book by different animals, because each case study looks at a different animal, but also a different type of possession claim that the English make. So a different kind of legal possession claim that the English make. For the English, colonization is about possessing the land, occupying the land, possessing it, transplanting a migrant population to occupy that land, and ordering that land, drawing lines on the ground, creating a nice rational order, creating property to be privately possessed, and establishing rules that govern those little nice, neat, rational, orderly parcels of land. Throughout this period that I'm studying, though, animals, to put it colloquially, mess up that nice rational vision that the English colonizers want to erect. And so each one of the case studies that I do is looking at a different way in which the actions of animals mess up English ideas and eventually Anglo-American ideas, legal ideas about property.
Why don't we start digging into a few of Andrea's case studies? As she just mentioned, Andrea organized the chapters of Wild by Nature around different animals: beavers, wolves, deer, fish, and bison. So why don't we start by exploring her first case study, which is about beavers? Andrea, would you tell us about Bacon's Rebellion of 1676? Because in Wild by Nature, you note that we really need to view this event in the wider colonial context of the transatlantic fur trade. So why don't we start with Bacon's Rebellion? What was this rebellion about?
In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, who's a planter on the Virginia frontier, he has an overseer who is killed by Native Americans. It's not clear which group of Native Americans killed his overseer, and they commit some other attacks on other frontier farms. And Nathaniel Bacon gets together a group of other planters who live on the frontier, and they demand action from the colonial government to protect them from Native Americans. When the colonial government doesn't act quickly enough or sort of decisively enough against the Native Americans, Bacon decides to take it upon himself to create a militia to go after Native Americans and wage a sort of indiscriminate war of extermination. So this is a kind of an internal civil war between the colonial government and these backcountry planters who are wanting to exterminate Native Americans, and they try to force a war with the Native Americans. It's a short-lived rebellion. There's some interesting parts where Nathaniel Bacon marches into the seat of government and forces the colonial assembly to adopt laws, which then are quickly repealed as soon as he leaves. Eventually, Nathaniel Bacon gets a disease and dies, and the rebellion falls apart, and the British government takes control again. But some people have tended to see this as kind of a dress rehearsal for the revolution.
Okay, and so now that we know more about this rebellion, would you tell us what role the beaver played in this rebellion?
Well, Bacon's Rebellion is kind of your classic textbook colonial history event, right? For colonial historians, I think Bacon's Rebellion is kind of the Rorschach test of colonial history, because you can see in it whatever you want to see. And colonial historians have interpreted Bacon's Rebellion in a variety of different ways. They've understood it as a prelude to the American Revolution. They've seen it as being caused by class conflict, as an Eastern-Western dispute, as a part of a wider set of Indian wars, as a turning point in the transition to slavery. So all sorts of different interpretations of what Bacon's Rebellion was about. But if you look at what people who were involved in Bacon's Rebellion said, and what Nathaniel Bacon himself said, was that it was mostly about the beaver trade. That was the primary complaints of the rebels in Bacon's Rebellion, was that the colonial governor, William Barclay, had monopolized the beaver trade. They saw the colonial government protecting Native American middlemen in the beaver trade at the expense of frontier farmers who were being exposed to attacks by Native Americans. So for Bacon and his followers, they saw control over the beaver trade as the main issue. So to understand what was going on with the Chesapeake beaver trade, in this case, we're talking about beavers that were not in the Chesapeake. The best beaver hunting territories were farther away, were in the interior of the continent, around the Great Lakes, in the lake country of northern New York, in Canada. And so to get access to the beaver trade, colonists had to make use of Native American middlemen who would go into the interior, trade for and capture beavers, and bring the furs back to these colonial centers. And that allowed Native Americans to move freely across these colonial boundaries. And that's what provoked this dispute with these backcountry farmers and backcountry planters in the 1670s, was the fact that in order to profit from the beaver trade, colonial authorities were allowing Native Americans to move across colonial boundaries at will, and move across their farms, and exposed in the process these frontier farmers to violence. The dispute over the beaver trade and that dispute that goes on in Bacon's Rebellion, to me, really reveals that at that point in time, there was a question being raised about what type of colonialism the English would pursue. Either an extractive colonialism, which was represented by that beaver trade that was going on in the interior of the continent. And it was an extractive colonialism that was really kind of dominated by Native Americans. Native Americans controlled that extractive colonialism in the interior, extracting the resources, this animal resource, versus a settler colonialism on the eastern seaboard. And the dispute, that frontier line that Bacon lived on, Nathaniel Bacon and the rebels, was that line between the extractive colonialism and settler colonialism. And that Virginia frontier was the line separating those two forms of colonizing. So the conflicts over the beaver trade, I think, convinced English colonizers that extractive colonialism was not going to work for them, that you couldn't put settler colonialism and extractive colonialism together, that you had to control the land and the animals, not just extract the resources from the land.
This seems like it was one of those restrictions that animals imposed on colonial settlement. That the beaver and the quest to acquire its pelts highlights how extractive colonization didn't work for the English who settled and practiced settler colonialism in the Chesapeake.
Right. You can't combine extractive colonialism and settler colonialism in this case.
Now, while the beaver helped the English realize that they preferred to settle in farmland in North America rather than just extract its resources, one animal put a crimp in these plans for settlement and land use. And that animal was the wolf. Andrea, would you tell us about the English colonists' experiences with wolves?
You know, wolves are kind of unique in my book because the other animals that I look at are all seen as being particularly useful to settlement. Clearly, wolves were not particularly useful to settlers. In some ways, wolves kind of stand for a whole class of animals, predators that are predators and pests, or vermin species that settlers wanted to eliminate. It's also, what's interesting about wolves, the wolf story, is that it's a contrast with the beavers, where the beavers were a distant animal resource that for colonizers in the Chesapeake, they rarely encountered in a living state. They only encountered them in the form of furs. Wolves had a very direct effect on animals and on people in the Chesapeake. The problems with wolves was that wolves really attacked the basis for colonial settlement, and particularly in the English understandings of legal possession. So for the English, legal possession rested on productive use of the land, and that involved improving the land. And by improvement, the English meant doing things like clearing the land, fencing it, or turning the land to agricultural uses, farming, turning it into a pasture, planting livestock on the land, putting cattle or sheep on the land. And that was the way that you asserted a claim to the land. If you improved the land, you had a possession claim. Simply put, wolves ate colonists' improvements. When wolves crossed into farmers' fields. And of course, from the wolves' perspective, they were very happy to have the English colonists come and bring sheep and pigs and cattle to their land as a nice, tasty addition to the landscape for wolves. So they changed their habits. They began attacking colonist livestock, breaking into their enclosures, eating their sheep. And by doing that, they directly attacked the legal claim that colonists had on the land. They were eating people's improvements. And so that became a real threat to settlement, because if a settlement's based on improving the land and these wild animals are eating your improvements, you're losing your claim on the land.
You know, one of the curious things to me is that the English clearly preferred to enclose their lands as a way to mark boundaries and to organize their land. And yet, I read in other history books and historical sources how they let their livestock roam free on lands around them that they didn't really own. And I wonder, what types of problems did free-ranging livestock cause for English settlers and settlement plans? And what types of problems must these domesticated animals have caused for Native American peoples who lived on these other lands around the settlers?
Well, the transition to free-range livestock husbandry really happened over time. So initially, English colonists expected to enclose their land, enclose their livestock. And there were a lot of laws in colonial Virginia about making fences, enclosing your livestock, making sure that your livestock was contained. But in colonial Virginia, labor was scarce. Land was not scarce. And so those kinds of intensive agricultural practices that were kind of characteristic of English agriculture, right? Enclosing land, penning up your animals, manuring fields, that didn't make a lot of sense in an environmental context where you don't have the labor to cut down trees and build fences, but you have a lot of land available. And so there was a transition toward free-range livestock husbandry. And wolves played a part in that transition to free-range husbandry because of the fact that they did attack people's animals. They penned up their animals and wolves attacked them. You've really lost any kind of benefit from all of your labor to enclose your animals. And so there was this transition to, one, choosing livestock that were a little bit better able to fend for themselves, were more resistant to wolf attack. So turn away from sheep raising toward raising cattle and particularly hogs, letting them roam free so you're not putting a lot of labor into them. So if you have some losses to predators, you haven't lost a lot of your labor in them as well. And so there was this shift to free-range husbandry as a way of meeting both the restrictions of a limited amount of labor, but also the predations of wolves and other predators. And of course, this created problems with Native Americans because this free-range animals, free-range livestock, particularly hogs, would cross into Native American fields and eat their crops, destroy their crops. And so that created a number of conflicts between colonists and Native Americans over colonists' free-ranging livestock.
Now, what other ways did English colonists use to combat wolves? I mean, they allowed their livestock to roam free and have a fighting chance, if you will. But did they undertake any other measures to protect their land and domesticated animals against wolves?
Oh, certainly. Perhaps the most common law about animals in early America were bounty laws. Statute books are full of laws being passed to encourage settlers and Native Americans to hunt and kill wolves. So they offer monetary rewards for killing wolves. And those laws become subject for dispute as areas become more settled and they start to destroy wolves and eliminate them from one area. The settlers in these more settled areas where the wolves have been eradicated decide that they don't want to pay taxes and pay the costs of wolf eradication in frontier areas. And so in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, you see a whole lot of disputes between people in eastern counties, in eastern areas where the wolves have been eradicated, and those on the frontier. And these disputes take the form of legislative petitions. So people on the frontier want bounties to encourage the hunting of wolves. People in the settled areas want to eliminate bounties because they don't want to pay the cost. And it really raises a question of who is responsible for improving the land. In the English context, again, in that idea that you possess the land by improving your little parcel that's within your boundaries, that doesn't work in this environmental context where wolves can cross into those boundaries and destroy your improvements. So in order to possess the land, your little parcel of land, you also have to think about improving the wilderness around your land. You have to eliminate those predators from those woods and the forests and the mountains that are surrounding you. And the question becomes, whose responsibility is that? Is that an individual responsibility, or is it the responsibility as a government or a collective responsibility? And throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, early 19th centuries, you see that dispute being carried out in laws and legislative petitions. Bounty laws get passed, they get repealed, they get changed, they get reasserted at various times. And that's why there's so much lawmaking about bounties, is because people can't decide whose responsibility is to control predators.
Now, another animal that muddied the waters a bit, as Andrea puts it in her book, Wild by Nature, was the fish. In fact, she says that fish muddied the legal waters of possession perhaps more than any other wild creature. So after we talk about our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus, we should talk about fish. Andrea mentioned that one of the places she looked in the historical record for information about animals was in promotional literature and in early accounts by explorers of North America. And I've read a few of these accounts over the years, and one account that always sticks out in my mind is the one that Henry Hudson wrote. Hudson spent a lot of time talking about fish, and how the river that would come to bear his name was full of fish. Of course, Henry Hudson's exploration of the Great North, or Hudson River, was part of his attempt to find the fabled Northwest Passage to the East Indies. Hudson's story is really interesting, and it's one the Great Courses Plus can help you explore in its course, National Geographic Polar Explorations. As its title suggests, the Great Courses Plus partnered with National Geographic to create this course, and it's one you can take for free during the free trial the Great Courses Plus will give you when you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. In National Geographic Polar Explorations, 5 Arctic and Antarctic experts will guide you through an exquisite visual journey through the science, culture, and history of the Earth's polar regions. And one of your stops on this tour is a 30-minute long video called The Saga of Arctic Exploration, where you can discover more about Henry Hudson and others who tried to find that fabled Northwest Passage. The Great Courses Plus has over 8,500 lectures in its vast library that will help you satisfy your curiosity about history, science, math, psychology, and about how to perform new skills like cooking, photography, and speaking a new language. All of these fascinating lectures are presented by award-winning professors and experts in easy-to-watch 30-minute long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices. So visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to extend your exploration of history and to delve into new topics that just fascinate you. To claim your free trial of the Great Courses Plus, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Okay, Andrea, would you tell us about fish and how they muddied the waters of English legal possession?
Well, the fish, again, it goes back to this idea that is there from the earliest encounters in North America with the animals, is this idea that people should have free access to American animals, that is this incentive for settlement. It's what you hold out to potential migrants to say that if you come here, you have access to these animal resources that you can use, and that no one owns the animals. So that's really what it comes down to, that animals are unowned, they're free, and they're wild. And so fish are a really important resource to early settlers, particularly what are known as anadromous fish. So these are the fish that are born in freshwater, migrate to the ocean, to saltwater, and then come back to freshwater streams to spawn. Fish like herring, shad, that migrate at particular times of the year and in great numbers. So in these rivers that are coastal rivers that flow inland, you have seasons where the fish are migrating in vast numbers. They're fairly easy to catch, and so they become a really important food resource and a commercial resource as well to settlers. But the problem with fish is that they swim. And in swimming along a river, they end up swimming through different types of property law regimes, depending on where they're at. So in Anglo-American law, just to back up a little bit here, one of the key ideas in Anglo-American property law is the notion of severability, which is the idea that you can take the natural world and you can divide it up into its different attributes. And you can apply different laws or rules of ownership to those different attributes. And so a river, along the length of an entire river, you might have many different types of property law arrangements along that river. You could have private property on the banks of the river, but this middle of the river could be a public highway. There can be a fishing stand that is a common property, has common use rights attached to it. So there's different property regimes all along a river, but the fish are in the river and they essentially are swimming through all of those different property regimes. And so people's access to the fish, which they believe is free access, it is an open access resource, they should always be able to have access to it. But depending on where the fish are at, they might not be able to reach them. And so again, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, you see a number of legislative petitions being filed with the government protesting people's use of the rivers, particularly in the case of mill dams. In the late 18th, early 19th century, rivers are becoming much more industrialized. You have people building mill dams and grist mills, sawmills, and appropriating the current of the river to run their mill. The person who builds a mill doesn't really care about the fish. They're not looking to own the fish, but because they've appropriated that current of the river, they've built a dam, they've blocked the migration of the fish. And so their actions downstream affect the access to fish that people have upstream. And so it becomes this particularly complicated process where people are trying to figure out how to retain that free access, that open access to fish, while still being able to use the different attributes of the river and own those different attributes of the river in different ways and apply different kinds of property rules to them.
Did early Americans ever find a solution to their need to find balance between regulating rivers and waterways for industrial uses like mills and the people's right to have access to fish in these rivers and waterways?
Initially, there's, again, a kind of transition from the 18th century to the early 19th century. So initially, these early legislative petitions that are complaining about mill dams preventing the migration of fish, legislators tend to see these as reasonable complaints, and they try to impose laws that will allow fish to continue to migrate. So they require mill dam owners to install fish slopes, some kind of passageway, or to leave their dams open certain times of the year so that fish can pass through. For the most part, though, these things are not terribly successful. And eventually, over time, as industrial uses become much more important, lawmakers tend to focus much more on the benefits of mill dams as a kind of public good. And so they tend to support the construction of mill dams to the detriment of fish. And so actually fish populations in many cases decline. But they decline for a variety of reasons, not just the mill dams, but also because of farming that tends to muddy the streams and also overfishing generally. But again, it's throughout this period, the disputes over fish really kind of show how difficult it is to apply these very rational laws about property, these English Anglo-American ideas about property, to something that's as mobile as a fish.
We've been discussing how animals impacted early Americans' ideas about land and English colonists' plans to tame North American lands. And in Wild by Nature, Andrea asserts a very intriguing idea, which is that the behaviors of specific animals, beavers, wolves, deer, and fish, all presented distinct sets of obstacles to colonists, while also providing Native Americans with tools of resistance. Andrea, would you tell us how beavers, wolves, deer, and fish supplied Native Americans with tools that they could use to resist English and later Anglo-American colonization?
The two really good examples of this, I think, are deer and bison. So in one chapter, I look at deer in the Appalachians in Kentucky and in the Carolinas. And also in the last chapter, I look at bison in the Southern Plains. And in both of these cases, the presence of animals become a sort of legal claim that Native Americans can assert over their hunting grounds, the places where they hunt animals. in the Carolinas, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw Indians, who are very involved in the deerskin trade of the 18th century, are able to establish a claim to their hunting grounds. That's a claim that's actually enforced for a while by American authorities, a claim to these vast areas of land where they hunted. And there's actually laws around the Revolution preventing trespass on Indian hunting grounds. The colonial authorities will actually go in and remove white squatters who are settling in these areas. They actually also try to make sure that there are boundary lines marking Indian hunting grounds to separate that from areas that are open to settlement. So they're actually trying to prevent trespass on Indian hunting grounds to prevent disputes between Native Americans and American settlers. In the Southern Plains, there's treaty making that goes on after the Civil War, again, to try to control and eliminate sort of disputes between settlers and Native Americans. There's treaties written in the 1860s, 1867 Medicine Lodge Treaty is a particularly interesting case that tied Kiowa Comanche claims to hunt on lands south of the Arkansas River to the existence of buffalo there. So the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, which I think is unique, Medicine Lodge Treaty and the Fort Laramie Treaty for the Northern Plains are somewhat unique treaties because they're the only treaties I've found that tie Native American land claims directly to a specific animal, to bison. So the Medicine Lodge Treaty says that the Kiowa and the Comanche had the right to hunt on these lands south of the Arkansas River. So this is in the Texas Panhandle and northeastern New Mexico. They have the right to hunt on those lands so long as there are enough bison there to justify the chase. This is how they put it. And so, in a sense, and as I argue in the book, that sort of makes the bison a party to the treaty, that they are part of what give the Kiowa and the Comanche a continuing claim to hunt on that land. So for the Kiowa and the Comanche, this claim to hunting grounds is particularly important. For the people who are negotiating this treaty, the Indian agents who negotiate this treaty, for them, they don't see that claim as being terribly important. They see the more important claim for the Kiowa and Comanche was to their reservation lands that they had been guaranteed as their permanent home. But for the Kiowa and Comanches, who were highly mobile people who had economies and sort of societies that were based on buffalo hunting, actually that claim to the buffalo hunting grounds was much more important. And it was also an interesting treaty because of the idea that it was tied to kind of an unspecified number of buffalo, so long as there were enough there to justify the chase. Well, the Indian agents, American Indian agents, had a very different idea of what that number was compared to the Kiowa and the Comanche. American Indian agents who negotiated that treaty believed that the number of buffalo that were still in the areas south of the Arkansas River were already so few that it really didn't justify the chase. To them, this was a moot point. To the Kiowa and the Comanche, however, so long as there was one buffalo south of the Arkansas River, they still had a claim to that land. So tying these land claims to animals gave Native Americans at least a kind of legal standing that allowed them to make an argument that they still had a sort of legal claim to these lands that settlers wanted.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if, say, the Spanish, French, or Dutch, instead of the English and their descendants, had been largely responsible for colonizing most of North America? How would changing the dominant settlers, and therefore the dominant cultural perception of wildlife, change the history of North American colonization?
Well, I think the key thing that I see going on here, this argument is sort of woven through the entire book, is that the connection that develops between wild animals and ideas of liberty that happen as a result of the particular context of English colonizing. That's a particularly English or Anglo-American colonizing theme. And I think that that's tied to this English form of colonizing that is based on settlement. And so from the very beginning of those first encounters with North American animals, this promise of access to animals as an incentive for settlement, and that free and democratic access to animals is sort of an American birthright almost. That is, I think, tied particularly to this English form of colonizing that would have been very different had it been the Spanish or the French, for example, where their colonizing was based, particularly in relation to animals, was based much more on, particularly, let's say, the French, on extraction, on this extractive colonialism. They weren't holding out the promise of free access to animals. And so that, I think, would have been very different. It would have had a very different impact on the animals, and I think it would have had a different impact on how colonizing progressed. I think that this connection between liberty and wild animals, which is repeated in English colonizing texts over and over again, is really what then leads us to this idea eventually that animals are kind of part of the public trust, that animals are the property of no one, and then eventually they become the property of the state and they're held in common for the people. And that really, I think, has its origins in these patterns of English colonizing that are based on land appropriation and settlement rather than on extraction. So I think it gave rise to a lot of things that we see today, the understanding that wild animals are for all of us. They're not something that can be owned.
Andrea, now that you've explored how animals open possibilities and impose constraints on English and Anglo-American settlement of North America, what are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm actually picking up sort of where this book leaves off. So I end Wild by Nature in the late 19th century and the rise of the progressive era conservation movement, which I see as being a direct consequence of English colonizing and Anglo-American colonizing in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm picking up where that book ends and exploring, doing a history of commercial hunting in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly the commercial hunting of wildfowl, of birds. So looking at, hunting ducks or even the feather trade for hats, for women's hats. And I'm trying to explore how market hunting shaped the conservation movement in America.
And if we have questions about environmental history and the ways animals impacted the colonization of North America, where and how can we contact you?
Probably the best place is the Northern Illinois University website, which is niu.edu.
Andrea Smalley, thank you for helping us explore a bit about early American environmental history and for showing us some of the ways that wild animals impacted colonists' plans for settlement.
Well, thanks for talking with me. I enjoyed it.
Environmental historians study the environment to explain interactions between the human and non-human world. They recognize that, in many ways, the environment participated as a historical actor in the events and decisions of the past. And as Andrea revealed, we can see the role the environment played when we look at how wild animals disrupted and impacted Europeans' colonization of North America. All European explorers and early colonists remarked upon the abundance of the animals they encountered in North America. For the French and Spanish, who practiced extractive colonization, the animals were both a curiosity and a potential source of profit. But for the English, who wanted to tame and settle the land, animals proved to be bothersome. In many ways, these wild creatures challenged English notions of what it meant to possess the land. For example, beavers incited rebellion, as a quest to acquire their pelts from northern New York, New France, and the Great Lakes meant that colonial Virginia passed and supported laws that allowed Native American fur traders to roam freely over the land, which frontier residents often felt put their persons and property at risk. Wolves, on the other hand, directly confronted and challenged English colonists' notions of land possession. To possess the land, English colonists believed that you had to improve and tame the land. So they cleared trees to create crop fields, fenced in those fields to protect them from both wildlife and other humans, and they added livestock in an effort to make their farms more productive. Using the land in this way demonstrated their ownership and command over the land. Only, wolves ignored and challenged this command. Wolves snuck into fenced-in areas and ate the colonists' livestock. So, with ineffective fences and fewer domesticated animals on their farms, Could English colonists really claim that they had command over their land? And then there were the deer and bison. These animals provided Native Americans with valuable tools that they used to resist Anglo-American colonization. Native American peoples used these animals and the important roles they played in their cultures and ways of life when they negotiated treaties, at first with colonial governments and later with the United States government. These treaties recognized Native Americans' rights to hunt and make use of the land wherever these animal herds may roam. And for their part, governments worked to enforce these treaties in an effort to limit discord and disagreement between settlers and Native American peoples. So, whether they liked it or not, it seems the environment and its wild creatures shaped the ways early Americans viewed, used, and possessed the land. Look for more information about Andrea, her book Wild by Nature, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/168. If you're interested in learning more about the different roles wild animals have played throughout human history, check out our sponsor, The Great Courses Plus, as they have all sorts of courses that explore animals and human-animal interactions. To claim your free trial, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Don't forget to stay up to date with Ben Franklin's World by joining our email list. Text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com. Holly White provided production assistance for this episode. Thanks so much, Holly. Finally, what do you think? Do you think we should study history with an eye toward considering the environment as a historical actor and even active participant in history? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @Liz Covart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.